Here is your story, 3,000 words, clean and continuous, no headings, no part markers. Dale Hargrove had never once in 68 years asked where the cornbread came from. It was simply there every Sunday. Golden on top, dark at the bottom from the cast iron, crackling at the edges the way good cornbread does when it has been made correctly and with patience. It sat in the center of the long table in the cookhouse, between the brisket and the beans, and Dale would take a piece without looking at it and eat it without thinking about it, the same way a man breathes. He had other things to think about. 400 acres of dry West Texas land will fill a man's mind without effort. There were fence lines that argued with the weather and cows that found holes in those fence lines and the holes that followed rain, which was never enough, and drought, which was always too much. There were hands to pay and feed costs to argue with and a cattle market that moved the way cattle move, slowly, unpredictably, and never in the direction you needed. Dale thought about all of these things. He thought about them at the table and in the truck and at night when he should have been sleeping. He did not think about cornbread. His wife Connie had understood this about him. She had understood most things about him without requiring that he explain them, which was one of the principal reasons their marriage had worked for 41 years. She made the cornbread on Saturdays and it appeared on the table Sundays and Dale ate it and the week continued. This was the arrangement. Neither of them had ever felt the need to name it. Connie died in December, on a cold morning that felt dishonest for West Texas, which does not usually bother being cold. She went quietly, in the way she had lived, without making a fuss, without requiring anyone to rearrange themselves on her behalf. Dale sat next to her bed for the last few hours and held her hand and did not say much because there was nothing left that hadn't already been said across 41 years of mornings. He came back to work the following Monday. The hands did not know what to say to him, so they said very little, which was the correct choice. Dale appreciated that. A man who has worked ranches his whole life understands that silence, offered properly, is a form of respect. The first Sunday without Connie, Dale sat down at the table expecting nothing. The cornbread was there. He looked at it for a moment. He assumed one of the hands' wives had taken over, someone he hadn't thought to thank yet, and he made a note in his mind to do so, and then he took a piece and ate it and went on with the meal and said nothing. He told himself he would ask later. He did not ask later. There was always a fence or a cow or a cost to occupy the space where the question should have lived, and Sundays kept coming, and the cornbread kept appearing, and the weeks passed the way weeks do on a ranch, heavy and fast at the same time, full of work, short of rest. 8 months went by this way. Then came the last Sunday of August, and a piece of cornbread changed everything. Dale bit into it the way he always did, without looking, without thinking, his mind already moving toward the afternoon and the south pasture fence he needed to ride before the week started. But the bite stopped him. Something was in the flavor that he had not been paying attention to and suddenly could not ignore. A sweetness under the salt. A depth he could not name, something warm and familiar in a way that made his chest tighten without giving him a reason. He chewed slowly. He set the piece down. He looked at it the way he looked at a fence line that didn't add up, with his full attention, for the first time. He picked it up and took another bite to make sure he had not imagined it. He had not imagined it. He set it down again and looked at the table. 6 men and 1 boy, eating, passing the beans, saying the ordinary things men say at Sunday meals on ranches, complaints about the heat, a story about a truck that needed something, the kind of conversation that fills a room without requiring anyone to think very hard. Dale was not a man who interrupted. He waited until the table had a moment of natural quiet, the way quiet sometimes falls between men who are comfortable with each other, and then he asked, not directing the question at anyone in particular, not quite looking up from his plate. "Who made this cornbread?" The silence that followed was not ordinary silence. It was the kind of silence that has a shape to it, that the people in a room can feel pressing against them. One of the older hands, a man named Roy who had worked for Dale for 19 years, put his fork down very carefully. Another man, Eddie, looked at the table. Nobody looked at Dale. From the far end of the table, a hand went up. Small hand. 13 years old, attached to a boy named Marcus Webb, who was sitting in the last seat on the bench, the seat closest to the door, the seat a person picks when they are not entirely sure they belong in the room. "I did, sir," Marcus said. "Mrs. Hargrove taught me." The room did not move. Marcus was Jerome Webb's son. Jerome had come on as a hand 6 months ago, in February, a good worker, steady and reliable, the kind of man who showed up 10 minutes early and never needed to be told a thing twice. He had brought his son with him because there was no one else to leave Marcus with, and Dale had said nothing about the boy being there because the boy had given him no reason to say anything. Marcus stayed out of the way. He read books in the truck or sat on the fence watching the work without being asked to participate or stay away. He was quiet in the way that some children are quiet, not shy exactly, but self-contained, present without being intrusive. Dale had noticed him the way he noticed most things that weren't causing a problem. Which is to say, barely. Now Marcus sat at the end of the table with his hand still slightly raised and his eyes on Dale, waiting for whatever came next with the patience of someone who had learned early that reactions from adults were often unpredictable and it was better to wait than to guess. Dale looked at him for a long moment. "She taught you," Dale said. "Yes, sir. Since March. Afternoons, mostly, when you were out on the south pasture." Dale was quiet. He looked at the cornbread on his plate. He looked back at Marcus. "For how long?" he asked. "About 3 months before she passed," Marcus said. "And I've been making it since then. Every Saturday, same as she showed me. She left me her notes." Nobody at the table was eating anymore. Roy's fork was still down. Eddie was looking at the wall. Jerome, who was sitting 2 seats down from his son, was looking at his hands, and there was something in the way Jerome sat, very still, very careful, that suggested he had known this moment would come eventually and had been quietly waiting for it the way a man waits for a thing he knows is inevitable. Dale looked at his son's hands too for a moment, then back at Marcus. "She left you notes," Dale said. "In a spiral notebook. Blue cover. She wrote the recipe and wrote down the reasons for each step, why you do it that way and not another way. She said a recipe without reasons is just instructions, and instructions don't teach you anything." Something moved across Dale's face. It was not grief exactly, not surprise exactly. It was more like recognition, the feeling of finding something you didn't know was missing. Because that was exactly the kind of thing Connie would say. Dale had spent 41 years listening to Connie say things that were entirely correct and slightly uncomfortable to hear, delivered in her plain, unhurried voice, without any apparent awareness that she had just said something a person ought to write down. She was not a woman who thought her observations were remarkable. She simply observed, accurately, and moved on. A recipe without reasons is just instructions, and instructions don't teach you anything. Yes. That was hers. That was entirely hers. He looked at the cornbread again. He thought about Connie watching this boy every afternoon for 3 months, in the kitchen that he, Dale, walked through without looking, teaching him a recipe that had come down from her mother in East Texas, the one piece of kitchen knowledge she had called irreplaceable, the one thing she had said she would never want to see disappear from the world. He thought about her choosing Marcus to give it to. He thought about what it meant that she had chosen Marcus. He did not ask Marcus any of these things out loud. The table was quiet enough that such questions would have landed too heavily. Instead he looked at the boy once more, and then he stood up, and he walked the length of the table, and he stopped beside Marcus and stood there for a moment. He put one hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Once, briefly, the way you touch something to confirm it is real." Then he went back to his seat. He picked up his piece of cornbread and ate it. He took another piece after that. He did not speak for the rest of the meal, and neither did anyone else, and the silence this time was completely different from the silence before. It was full rather than empty, the kind of silence that happens after something has been said that doesn't need to be added to. Roy picked up his fork. Eddie went back to his beans. Jerome looked at his son for a moment with an expression that Marcus would later say he had never seen on his father's face before, not pride exactly, but something that lived in the neighborhood of relief, as if a weight Jerome had been carrying carefully for months had been set down. After the meal, Dale walked to the cookhouse kitchen, which he had not entered in 8 months, not once since Connie died. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the space. The cast iron pan Marcus had used was soaking in the sink. The counter was clean. The blue spiral notebook was sitting on the shelf above the stove, next to a small jar of bacon grease and a box of cornmeal, positioned with the neat practicality of someone who used it regularly. Dale did not pick it up. He was not ready for that yet. He looked at it for a while, then went back outside. That evening he sat on the porch in the chair where he had always sat, in the hour of the day that still felt the emptiest, when the light goes orange and long and the work is done and there is nothing between a person and their thoughts. He thought about Connie. Not with the raw, breathless grief of the first months, but with something gentler, the slow, bearable sadness of understanding that a person you loved was larger than you had fully known while they were living. He had known she was generous. He had not known the specific shape of this generosity. She had seen a boy arrive on their ranch in February, a quiet, self-contained child with no mother and a father who worked from dark to dark, a boy who ate meals at the cookhouse table because that was the arrangement and then disappeared back into a bunkhouse corner with a book, and she had looked at him the way she looked at most things, carefully, without announcing that she was looking, and she had seen what was missing. Not food. Not shelter. Not anything you could point to and name in a sentence. Something older than that. A kitchen to belong to. Someone to stand next to. The feeling of being taught something that mattered, by someone who believed you were worth teaching. Connie had offered him all of this in the form of an afternoon and a cast iron pan and a spiral notebook with a blue cover, on the days when Dale was out in the south pasture not knowing any of it was happening. This was entirely like her. Dale sat on the porch until the light was gone. Then he went inside. The next morning he found a spare notebook in the drawer where Connie had kept the household papers, a plain one, cardboard cover, nothing special, and he brought it out to the kitchen table and sat down with a pen and thought for a long time. He was not a man who wrote things. He could write, fine, the way any man can, but writing had never been his tool for thinking. His tool for thinking was work, and walking, and silence. But he wrote something. He was not sure why at first, and then partway through the first sentence he understood. He wrote the name of every hand who had ever worked the Hargrove Ranch, going back as far as he could remember, all the way to the men his grandfather had talked about. He wrote down what he knew about each one, where they were from, what they were good at, whether they had a family. He wrote down the names of cattle that had been remarkable in some way and the stories attached to those cattle. He wrote down the year the south fence blew flat in a windstorm and how long it took to rebuild and who had done it. He wrote the way a person talks who has never talked much, directly, without decoration, leaving out the words that weren't necessary. He left the notebook in the cookhouse, in the same cabinet where Marcus kept the blue one. He did not tell Marcus it was there. He simply put it there and said nothing. Marcus found it the following Saturday when he came to make the cornbread. He read the first page standing at the counter, and then he sat down on the floor with his back against the cabinet and read the rest. Jerome found his son there an hour later and asked what he was doing. Reading, Marcus said, which was not untrue. Marcus left his own note on the last blank page of Dale's notebook that afternoon, a single line in the handwriting of a 13-year-old, careful, a little uneven, real. It said, "I will keep making it." Dale found it that evening. He read it 3 times. He put the notebook back in the cabinet. The next Sunday the cornbread was there. Dale ate it slowly, the way he had been eating it since that August afternoon when he first paid attention. He tasted the sweetness under the salt. He thought about Connie's mother in an East Texas kitchen passing the recipe to a girl who would one day carry it across hundreds of miles to West Texas and 41 years of Sundays and eventually, on weekday afternoons while her husband worked in the south pasture, pass it to a boy who needed something to carry. He did not know what to call what he felt. He was 68 years old and had spent most of those years in the business of naming practical things, fence damage, weather patterns, cattle weight. The feeling he was carrying now was not practical. It did not have a straightforward name. The closest word he had for it was, grateful. Not for what had been given to him specifically, but for the fact that Connie had understood that some things need to be passed on before there is no longer time to pass them, and she had understood this early enough to do something about it, and she had done it quietly, without making a production of it, without asking for recognition, the way she had done most things in her life. He was grateful that she had been that kind of person. He was grateful that he had known her. Marcus grew up on that ranch. Jerome stayed on as a hand for years and then eventually helped manage the place when Dale's knees made riding difficult. Marcus went on to become a chef, not a famous one, not the kind written about in magazines, but the kind who runs a small restaurant in a small Texas town where people come specifically for the food and not the atmosphere, and where the Sunday special, every week without exception, is cornbread from a cast iron pan, made from a recipe in a blue spiral notebook, golden on top and dark at the edges, with a sweetness underneath the salt that nobody can quite name but everybody notices. People ask him about it sometimes. Where did you learn to make it like this? Marcus always answers the same way. He says, a woman named Connie taught me, on a ranch outside Lubbock, on weekday afternoons when her husband was out working the south pasture. He says she left me her notes. He says she told me that a recipe without reasons is just instructions, and instructions don't teach you anything. And then he goes back to his kitchen, and the meal continues, and the cornbread is there, the way it has always been there, warm, present, needing no explanation. Some things carry people forward. Most of the time, those things are small,